There is a body of water sitting at the junction of 3 continents that covers roughly 2.5 million square kilometres, stretches a coastline of 46,000 kilometres across 21 countries, and connects to the Atlantic through a strait just 14 kilometres wide. On a map it looks modest, a long irregular gash between Europe to the north, Africa to the south, and Asia pressing in from the east. But size has never been the point. The Mediterranean Sea is not remarkable because of how large it is. It is remarkable because of what it did. For thousands of years, this almost entirely enclosed basin acted less like a body of water and more like a corridor, a place where civilizations did not simply exist beside each other, but collided, traded, borrowed, competed, and fused. The very geography that makes it seem like a contained, manageable sea is precisely what made it so explosive in its influence. Because the Mediterranean is nearly sealed off from the wider ocean, with that narrow opening at Gibraltar to the west, the Bosporus and Dardanelles threading toward the Black Sea in the northeast, and the Suez Canal cutting south toward the Red Sea, everything that entered the basin tended to stay and circulate. Ideas, goods, diseases, religions, legal systems and technologies did not drift away into open water. They bounced from shore to shore, accumulating and transforming across generations. Historians have long described the Mediterranean as an incubator of Western civilization, and that phrase, while sweeping, carries real weight. Permanent human settlements appeared along its shores as early as 12,000 years ago. The Egyptians, the Minoans, the Phoenicians, and the Greeks each used this sea as the backbone of their world, not as a barrier to cross, but as a highway to exploit. Rome eventually looked at the entire coastline and called it Mare Nostrum, our sea. And for roughly 4 centuries that description was accurate in the most literal sense. The legal frameworks, architectural forms, agricultural systems, and administrative structures that Rome spread across the Mediterranean basin did not vanish when the empire fractured. They became the substrate on which medieval Europe, the Byzantine world, and early Islamic civilization all built themselves. So the question this video sets out to answer is a genuinely large one. How did a single, semi-enclosed sea shape the trajectory of Western civilization across geology, trade, empire, religion, and law? And the answer requires going back further than most people expect, much further than the Greeks or even the earliest farmers. The story begins with a catastrophe. Around 6 million years ago, the Mediterranean did not look anything like it does today. The sea that existed then was cut off from the Atlantic, and over hundreds of thousands of years it largely evaporated. What was left behind was a vast alien landscape of salt flats and hypersaline pools sitting kilometres below sea level, a geological episode known as the Messinian Salinity Crisis. Then, roughly 5.25 million years ago, the Atlantic broke through. What followed was one of the most violent flood events in Earth's history, a torrent estimated at between 68 and 100 severdrups, meaning something approaching 1 million cubic metres of water per second, pouring through what would become the Strait of Gibraltar and refilling the entire basin over a period of perhaps 2 to 16 years. This was the Mediterranean's violent birth in its modern form, and without it, none of the rest of the story happens at all. From there, the video moves through the arrival of the first human settlers, the emergence of Egypt and the Great Eastern Kingdoms, the rise of the Minoans as the Mediterranean's first genuine sea power, and the extraordinary network of Phoenician routes that carried the alphabet and purple dye and glass across the entire basin long before Rome existed. Then come the Greeks, who turned the sea into a canvas for colonization and philosophy alike, followed by Carthage and the savage contest between North African ambition and Roman expansion that would define who controlled the Western Sea for centuries. After Rome, the story does not end. It transforms. The sea fractures into Byzantine and Islamic spheres, each reshaping what the Mediterranean grows, trades, and believes. Medieval Venice and Genoa turn Crusader-era commerce into the foundations of modern banking. And then the modern age arrives with its own disruption. The Suez Canal opens a channel that no longer just moves ships but moves entire ecosystems, flooding the Mediterranean with species from the Red Sea and the Indo-Pacific, while a warming climate accelerates every instability already in motion. What holds all of this together? Geology, ancient empires, medieval merchants, modern canals, and rising seas is that enclosed geography. The Mediterranean concentrated human contact in a way that open ocean simply cannot. Cooperation and conflict were both amplified, and the results echo in every legal system, religious tradition, and trade practice that the Western world still carries. This is the sea that built the world as we know it, and this is its full story. To understand what the Mediterranean became, you have to first understand what it once was, or rather, what it almost wasn't. Before there were sailors or merchants or emperors, before there were farmers on its shores or fishermen in its waters, the Mediterranean basin went through one of the most extreme geological transformations in the history of our planet. It dried up, not partially, not metaphorically, largely, catastrophically, and over a geologically brief period. A sea containing roughly 3.5 million cubic kilometers of water essentially ceased to exist as a body of water recognizable to us today. This event has a name, the Messinian Salinity Crisis. It began approximately 5.96 million years ago, give or take about 20,000 years, which sounds like a vast margin of uncertainty until you consider that we are talking about a planetary scale event from before our genus existed. The crisis unfolded in stages across several 100,000 years, but the most complete isolation of the Mediterranean from the Atlantic, the phase when the basin was truly cut off, lasted from roughly 5.59 to 5.33 million years ago. For the better part of 300,000 years, the sea that would eventually cradle Western civilization had no meaningful connection to the wider ocean, and without that connection, evaporation took over. To grasp why the connection failed, you need to look at the geology. The Mediterranean sits at the boundary between the African and Eurasian tectonic plates, and that boundary has never been stable. In the late Miocene epoch, the plate movements were doing something particularly consequential along what geologists call the Gibraltar Arc, the curved zone of collision where Africa was pressing northward against Europe in the west. Tectonic uplift, accompanied by strike-slip faulting along this plate boundary, gradually raised the land that connected southern Spain to North Africa, closing the two marine gateways that had allowed Atlantic water to flow freely into the Mediterranean basin. One of these corridors ran through what is now the Betic region of southern Spain, the other cut through northern Morocco. As the tectonic plates shifted and the land rose, both routes narrowed, shoaled, and eventually sealed. The Atlantic and the Mediterranean were no longer in meaningful communication. What made the situation worse was a coincidence of timing. A modest drop in global sea level, on the order of about 10 meters, driven by glacial processes far to the north, further restricted what little exchange might have remained through any residual shallow channels. 10 meters does not sound like much against the scale of an ocean, but in a shallow, narrowing strait it can be decisive. The combination of tectonic closure and this modest eustatic drop effectively turned the Mediterranean into a closed lake sea, isolated from the replenishment it needed to survive. Once isolated, physics took over with brutal efficiency. The Mediterranean already loses more water to evaporation than it gains from rainfall and river input. This remains true today, which is why Atlantic water still flows inward through the Strait of Gibraltar to replace the deficit. In the late Miocene, without that Atlantic inflow, evaporation simply consumed the basin. The rate of water loss has been estimated at around 3,300 cubic kilometres per year. Applied against roughly 3.7 million cubic kilometres of water, that rate would drain the basin in just over 1,000 years. In geological terms, that is nearly instantaneous, a blink. What was left behind staggers the imagination. The floor of the dried Mediterranean would have sat 3 to 5 kilometres below modern sea level, lower than the deepest part of the Dead Sea, far lower than Death Valley, lower than almost anywhere on the surface of the earth today. The landscape that emerged as the water retreated was not a single vast desert, but something more complex and in many ways more extreme. As salinity increased beyond the tolerance of ordinary marine life, the basin passed through successive stages of hypersalinity, leaving behind immense deposits of evaporate minerals, the chemical residue of an evaporating sea. Estimates of the total evaporate volume deposited during the Messinian Salinity Crisis reach up to 1 million cubic kilometres, representing something in the range of 4 times 10 to the 18th kilograms of salt, roughly 50 times the dissolved salt load currently present in the modern Mediterranean. That salt is still there, buried beneath the seafloor in thick layers that geologists have drilled through and mapped across the entire basin. Where water did remain, it pooled into isolated hypersaline pockets of almost unimaginable concentration. These remnant bodies, sometimes called the Lago Mare phase by researchers studying the final stages of the crisis, would have been environments hostile to almost all life, thick brines sitting at the bottom of a continent-sized depression, surrounded by barren salt flats and exposed sedimentary rock baking under a sun that, at such depths below sea level, would have beaten down into an atmospheric pressure significantly higher than anything humans have ever experienced. Temperatures in the deepest parts of the basin may have been extraordinary, the compressed air column above creating conditions with no easy modern analogue. The rivers that fed into this diminishing sea did not disappear. They kept flowing, but now they carved downward with tremendous erosive force, chasing a base level that had dropped by kilometres. The Nile is perhaps the most dramatic example. Evidence preserved in the geological record shows that the ancient Nile incised its valley more than 2.5 kilometres below modern sea level near what is now Cairo, cutting a canyon whose depth rivals anything visible on the surface of the earth today. That canyon was later buried under sediment when the sea returned, and the modern Nile Delta sits atop its filled remains, a geological ghost of the crisis hidden beneath one of the most historically significant landscapes in human history. Similar canyons were carved by the Rhône in what is now France, by the rivers of Spain, and by other tributaries that had once drained placidly into a full sea, and now found themselves plunging toward a distant, retreating floor. It is important to hold the scientific caution here alongside the spectacle. Some researchers argue that the basin never completely dried, proposing instead that persistent deep brine lakes occupied the lowest points throughout the crisis, and that the total desiccation scenario overstates the evidence. The precise volume of evaporates and the exact rate of water loss remain subjects of ongoing study, with estimates varying by up to 30% depending on the stratigraphic and geophysical methods used. What is not seriously in dispute is that the Mediterranean underwent a transformation of staggering scale, that the chemistry of the basin changed beyond recognition, that enormous quantities of salt were deposited, that the landscape of the basin floor was reshaped by erosion and evaporation alike, and that the sea as a functioning marine ecosystem was either entirely destroyed or reduced to a shadow of itself for hundreds of thousands of years. By the end of the crisis, something was still sitting in the deepest recesses of the basin, those remnant brine lakes, possibly fed by some trickle of water from the Black Sea region, or from rivers draining into the depression. But the Mediterranean as a sea had effectively ceased to function, and then, approximately 5.33 million years ago, something gave way in the west. the Atlantic broke through. What happened next was not a gradual refilling. It was a flood on a scale that has few, if any, rivals in the geological record, and it would restore the Mediterranean to the world in a matter of years rather than millennia. But before we get to that flood, it is worth pausing on what the Messinian Salinity Crisis actually means for the story we are trying to tell. This was not a minor chapter in the Mediterranean's prehistory. It was the event that defined the physical character of the basin, the thickness of its salt deposits, the depth of its buried canyons, the chemical properties of its waters, and the shape of the seabed that human civilizations would eventually learn to navigate. The salt left behind by the crisis affects how Mediterranean water circulates today. The canyon carved by the Nile determined in part where the Nile Delta could form, and the delta's formation shaped where ancient Egyptian civilization could take root. Every harbour that Greek sailors sheltered in, every fishing ground that Phoenician traders relied upon, every trade route that Roman galleys crossed, all of it was premised on a sea that existed only because of what happened 6 million years ago, and only in the form it took because of how completely it had previously collapsed. The Mediterranean that humans would come to know was not simply a natural feature of the landscape. It was a survivor of near-total destruction, refilled by catastrophe, and shaped in its geology and chemistry by the deep time of the Miocene world. The human story has lasted perhaps 12,000 years along these shores. The geological story that made those shores possible lasted 50 times longer, and it began with disappearance. The Atlantic did not politely return. When it broke through, it came with a violence that the geological record has been quietly preserving for over 5 million years, waiting for the right instruments and the right questions before giving up its evidence. The event geologists call the Zanclean megaflood began approximately 5.33 million years ago, and the name alone understates what it represents. This was not a flood in any sense that human experience offers a framework for. It was the moment when the barrier separating the Atlantic Ocean from a basin sitting kilometers below sea level, a depression more extreme than anything on Earth today, finally failed, and the ocean poured in with a force that has few rivals in the geological history of this planet. The physical mechanism is not difficult to visualize, though the numbers involved resist easy comprehension. The Atlantic sat at ocean level. The Mediterranean floor in its deepest basins sat somewhere between 3 and 5 kilometers lower. The region we now call Gibraltar, along with the connected corridors running towards Sicily, represented the threshold between these two worlds. As Atlantic water began to overtop whatever remained of the Gibraltar barrier, whether from tectonic movement, sea level change, or the gradual erosion of the sill itself, it did not simply flow downhill, it accelerated, and as it carved its initial channel deeper, the flow increased, which deepened the channel further, which increased the flow again. Geologists recognize this as a runaway feedback process, and in the Gibraltar scenario, it ran away very fast indeed. The numbers that researchers have extracted from field evidence and numerical modelling are staggering. A 2024 study published in Communications, Earth and Environment, drawing on both onshore geological evidence and hydrodynamic simulations, estimates peak discharge rates of between 68 and 100 spheredrups, where one spheredrup equals 1 million cubic meters per second. To frame what that means, the Amazon River, the largest river on Earth by discharge, moves approximately 0.2 spheredrups of water. The Zanclean flood, at its estimated peak, moved somewhere between 340 and 500 times that volume every single second. Earlier modelling focused specifically on the Gibraltar Channel had suggested peak discharges reaching on the order of 100 million cubic meters per second, with the bulk of the water transfer accomplished within a period of months to 2 years. Across the range of current models, the estimated duration stretches from as little as 2 years to as long as 16, with roughly 1,500 to 1,600 cubic kilometers of water delivered to the basin overall. What makes the 2024 research particularly compelling is the physical evidence it brings to the argument. Previous debates had relied heavily on modelling and on submarine observations that were difficult to interpret unambiguously. The newer work identifies more than 300 asymmetric, streamlined erosional ridges carved into the landscape of what is now southeastern Sicily, features that are essentially frozen signatures of catastrophic high-velocity flow. Alongside these ridges, researchers found a poorly sorted breccia layer, the kind of chaotic sedimentary deposit that results when a flood of extraordinary power rips through rock and soil and drops its cargo without the sorting that normal water flow produces. Crucially, a 20-kilometre wide shelf channel links these onshore features directly to the Noto Canyon offshore, a submarine structure that connects the land record to the seafloor record and traces the flood's path from the breached sill into the deep basin. Hydrodynamic simulations based on these findings suggest that once the Sicily sill was breached, flow velocities in that channel could have reached 32 meters per second, with discharge climbing toward 13 sverdrups in that regional section alone, directing the torrent toward the Malta escarpment and into the deep Mediterranean. The geological fingerprints of this event are not inferred from a single anomalous formation. They form a spatially coherent trail from the point of inflow to the basin beyond. Yet the science demands something important here, and intellectual honesty requires stating it plainly. These estimates are contested, and the uncertainties are genuine rather than trivial. Not all researchers accept the catastrophic flood model as the complete picture. Some argue that the refilling may have been considerably more gradual, proceeding through a combination of smaller-scale Atlantic inflow, contributions from Parathethian waters, the ancestral Black Sea and Caspian region, and possible residual connectivity that the catastrophic models underweight. The paleogeographic reconstructions that feed the models involve assumptions about ancient sill heights, basin volumes and sea levels that are difficult to constrain with precision, and different boundary conditions can produce very different flood magnitudes. A 2024 review in the Annual Review of Marine Science, surveying 50 years of hypotheses on the Messinian Salinity Crisis and its aftermath, documents the range of competing scenarios carefully and resists collapsing them into a single authoritative answer. The duration estimate alone, anywhere from 2 years to 16, represents an 8-fold range, which is not a minor calibration difference but a reflection of how much the underlying models diverge when fed different inputs. What the field broadly agrees on is that some form of dramatic Atlantic inflow occurred, that the evidence for catastrophic erosion in the Gibraltar and Sicilian corridor regions is real and difficult to explain by gradualist mechanisms alone, and that the Mediterranean was refilled from a radically lowered state to something approaching its modern configuration in a period that is geologically instantaneous, regardless of whether the flood lasted 2 years or 16. The argument is not really about whether the flood was extraordinary. It is about the precise degree of its violence and whether it acted alone or in concert with other processes. Standing back from the technical dispute, what matters for the story we are telling is the sheer transformation that this event accomplished. A basin that had been, by any reasonable description, a geological wasteland, kilometers deep salt flats, hypersaline remnant lakes, buried river canyons, exposed sedimentary rock, was converted, within what amounts to a geological eye blink, into a functioning marine sea. The Atlantic fauna that poured in with the flood colonized the new basin. The chemistry of the water shifted. The circulation patterns that govern the Mediterranean's distinctive character, the deep water formation in winter, the intermediate water production, the nutrient dynamics that determine where fish congregate, All of these began to establish themselves in the aftermath of that catastrophic inflow. The Mediterranean that emerged from the Zanclean flood was not identical to what had existed before the Messinian crisis, because the salt deposits, the new basin geometry carved by erosion, and the changed biological inheritance all made it something subtly different. But it was unambiguously a sea again, and that sea was now waiting through the Pliocene and Pleistocene, through ice ages that came and went and changed its salinity and sea level and shoreline positions, waiting through the slow and uneven process of evolution and migration that would eventually bring anatomically modern humans to its edges. When those humans arrived, and we will come to them shortly, they found a sea whose character had been defined by catastrophe, whose waters sat atop millions of years of salt, whose canyons and shelves bore the marks of a flood that no human eye ever witnessed. They found harbours they could sail from, fish they could catch, currents they could learn. They found, in other words, the stage. And on that stage, they would build everything that came next. The stage was already ancient when the first permanent communities arrived to claim it. By around 12,000 BC, as the last great ice age loosened its grip on the northern hemisphere and sea levels crept back towards something approaching their modern positions, human groups around the Mediterranean were doing something their predecessors had not quite managed. They were staying. Not following herds across seasonal ranges, not retreating with the cold and advancing with the warmth, but building, fishing, planting and returning to the same shores year after year. The Mediterranean, with its deeply indented coastline, its island stepping stones, its predictable seasonal rhythms, was not simply a backdrop to this process. It was an active participant in shaping what these communities became. The climate deserves credit that it rarely receives in historical accounts. The Mediterranean basin operates on a pattern that climatologists classify under the Köppen system as a dry summer, wet winter regime. Warm, wet winters that charge rivers and soil with enough moisture to sustain agriculture, followed by long, hot, reliably dry summers that allow crops to ripen and fish to be dried and stored. This rhythm was not an accident of geography. It was the consequence of the basin's precise position between the subtropical high-pressure system to the south and the mid-latitude westerlies to the north, a position that delivered rain when farmers needed it and sun when fishermen needed to preserve their catch. Communities settled into this seasonal cadence and built their economies around it, and the result was that coastal settlements could support themselves across the year, rather than depending on the brutal feast and famine logic that governed life in less favoured environments. Close spacing of settlements, communities within 20 or 30 kilometres of one another along the same coastline, made exchange natural, inevitable, and eventually systematic. But it was the sea itself that produced the most consequential behaviour. Water is a road, and the Mediterranean offered its early inhabitants a road of exceptional quality. Short crossings between visible landmarks, sheltered coves that served as natural harbours, islands close enough to the mainland that a determined group in a simple boat could reach them in a single day. These features turned what might have been a barrier into a corridor, and the humans who lived beside it recognised that fact with remarkable speed. The evidence is precise enough to be startling. In the French The Cave, tucked into the Argolic Gulf on the northeastern Peloponnese, archaeologists recovered fragments of obsidian, the dark volcanic glass prized for its razor-sharp edges, that originated not from mainland Greece but from the island of Melos, sitting in the southern Aegean, roughly 150 kilometres away across open water. The dates associated with this obsidian push back toward 13,000 BC, placing deliberate, organised sea crossings in the Upper Paleolithic period, long before anything we conventionally call civilization. Someone built or found a vessel capable of the crossing, navigated to Melos, extracted the stone, and returned. Whether this was a single extraordinary journey or part of a regular exchange network, we cannot say with certainty. The dating techniques involved have their limits, and not every archaeologist reads the tuna and obsidian evidence in the same way, but the object exists, the crossing happened. The Frenchley cave offers another piece of evidence that is, in some ways, even more impressive than the obsidian. Analysis of animal bones from the site reveals that by approximately 7,900 to 7,500 BC, tuna had become a major dietary staple for the community. Tuna do not live in rock pools. They are open ocean predators that require dedicated pursuit, which means the people of Franchley were not simply wading into the shallows with spears. They were going offshore, in boats sturdy enough to handle the Aegean, with nets or lines sophisticated enough to haul in large pelagic fish in quantities sufficient to form a dietary cornerstone. This is organised deep-water fishing, a maritime economy in embryonic form, appearing thousands of years before the civilizations that usually occupy the opening chapters of Mediterranean history. Off the Levantine coast, the submerged site of Atlit Yam tells a related but distinct story. Founded around 6,900 BC and abandoned roughly 6 centuries later, possibly as rising sea levels finally swallowed the settlement, which now lies beneath the waters of the Bay of Haifa, Atlit Yam was a village of some complexity. Its residents kept animals, cultivated plants, dug a stone-lined well, and exploited the sea with stone fish hooks and nets, whose use is evident from the piles of fish bones left behind. What the site demonstrates is a mixed economy, not purely maritime, not purely agricultural, but a practical synthesis that drew on every resource the coastal environment offered. Small boats were essential to this economy, enabling the short crossings and fishing expeditions that supplemented the land-based harvest. The people of Atlit Yam were not sailors in any grand sense, but they were comfortable on the water in a way that would become the defining characteristic of Mediterranean communities for the next 8,000 years. Cyprus makes the point about islands with particular force. The Aceramic Neolithic settlement of Kyrgyzstan, established around 7,000 BC in the island's southern interior, was no accidental outpost. It was a planned, permanent community of somewhere between 300 and 600 inhabitants. The population estimates depend on models built from house size and density, so the numbers carry some uncertainty. Living in tightly clustered round stone structures called tholoi, enclosed behind walls 2.5 meters thick. The fortifications alone tell you something important. This community expected to defend itself, which means it was large enough, organised enough, and valuable enough to be worth attacking. Getting to Cyprus from the Anatolian or Levantine mainland required crossing between 65 and 100 kilometres of open sea. The people of Kyrgyzstan did not arrive there by accident. They crossed deliberately, repeatedly, carrying animals and seeds, and the knowledge needed to build a functioning village from scratch on an island that had no indigenous human population. Regular sea trips back to the mainland would have been necessary for maintaining contact with source communities and sustaining whatever exchange networks supplied materials the island lacked. What emerges from these sites, when you lay them alongside one another, is a picture not of isolated cultures gradually stumbling toward contact, but of communities that were interconnected almost from the beginning of permanent settlement. The obsidian of Melos showing up in mainland Greece, the fishing villages of the Levant exploiting the sea's resources with purpose and method, the organised colonisation of Cyprus. Each represents a different expression of the same underlying reality. The Mediterranean did not separate its inhabitants. It connected them, and those connections began far earlier than the famous civilizations that would later dominate the historical record. The sea's particular genius as a setting for human development lay in a paradox it sustained for millennia. because communities were close enough to trade, to borrow ideas, to observe one another's innovations and adopt what worked. The Mediterranean world was perpetually cross-fertilized by contact. Yet because the sea also provided each community with its own productive coastline, its own climate niche, its own combination of resources, local cultures remained stubbornly distinct, developing languages, rituals, and material traditions that were uniquely their own, even as they participated in exchange networks that stretched hundreds of kilometers in every direction. The Mediterranean was not a melting pot. It was something more interesting, a system in which proximity produced influence without erasing difference, and where that productive tension between the local and the connected would eventually generate the conditions for everything that came next. What came next, in the Eastern Mediterranean above all, was something without precedent in human history: the emergence of large, literate, administratively complex states that recognized the sea not as the edge of their world but as the nervous system connecting it. Egypt is the obvious place to begin, not because it was the oldest or the most maritime of these powers, but because its relationship with the Mediterranean reveals something essential about how the sea functioned as a political and economic instrument rather than simply a geographic feature. Egypt's heart was the Nile, a river that ran north through desert and emptied through a spreading delta into the Mediterranean's southeastern corner. That delta was Egypt's interface with the wider world, and for centuries the pharaohs managed it with the same careful control they applied to everything else, in a state built on the principle that centralized administration was the foundation of civilized order. The port of Naucratis, sitting on the canopic branch of the Nile Delta, became Egypt's primary commercial gateway to the Greek world. Grain, linen and papyrus moved outward through its quays. Silver, timber, olive oil and wine moved inward. The scale of this exchange was sufficient to make Egypt one of the anchoring economies of the ancient Mediterranean, and the relationship was not purely commercial. The presence of Greek merchants and sailors at Naucratis was so significant that the city developed into a kind of semi-autonomous trading colony, one of the earliest examples of the Mediterranean's recurring pattern of embedding foreign commercial communities inside host ports. Some of the earliest Greek alphabetic inscriptions ever found appear on pottery recovered from Naucratis, which tells you something worth pausing on. Writing, one of the defining technologies of complex civilization, was circulating through the sea's trade networks, carried on the sides of pots by merchants who needed to mark their goods and record their transactions. Administrative knowledge and commercial practice were travelling the same routes as grain and olive oil. Egypt's relationship with the sea was never purely passive reception. Pharaoh Amasis II, whose reforms Herodotus documented with evident admiration, stationed Greek mercenary hoplites at Naucratis and organized a state-controlled naval capacity that gave Egypt both maritime expertise and a credible deterrent against foreign threats arriving from the sea's surface. The Mediterranean was a highway, and highways require policing. Egypt understood this long before Rome made the concept famous, but Egypt did not exist in isolation, even at the height of pharaonic power. The Eastern Mediterranean in the 2nd millennium BC was a densely interconnected political system, and the evidence for how it operated is extraordinary both in its detail and in what it reveals about the sea's role as a connector between civilizations that are sometimes taught as though they had nothing to do with one another. In the mid-14th century BC, during the reign of Akhenaten and his immediate predecessors, Egyptian scribes stored a collection of clay tablets at the royal city of Amarna that would remain buried until their rediscovery in the 1880s. These tablets, 382 of them, written not in Egyptian hieroglyphics but in Akkadian cuneiform, the diplomatic lingua franca of the ancient Near East, constitute the Amarna archive, and they are one of the most remarkable windows into ancient international relations that archaeology has ever produced. Their correspondents include Canaanite city-states along the Levantine coast, the Mitanni kingdom straddling the upper Euphrates, the Hittite Empire pressing down from Anatolia, and the great power of Babylon in Mesopotamia. The pharaoh wrote to them and they wrote back, addressing one another as brothers, negotiating the exchange of gold for lapis lazuli, of Egyptian luxury goods for Mesopotamian horses, of royal daughters for political alliance. The exact span these letters cover is debated. Most scholars place them across roughly 30 years, between approximately 1388 and 1332 BC, though the precise dating of individual tablets varies. But what is beyond debate is what they collectively demonstrate. The Eastern Mediterranean was not a collection of separate worlds. It was a single, integrated political and economic system, and the sea was its central corridor. The kingdoms that populated this system were not all coastal empires in the Egyptian mould. The Hittites ruled from the Anatolian plateau with an inland capital at Hattusa, far from any shoreline. The Mitanni drew their power from the great river valleys of the north, but both maintained access to the sea through coastal dependencies and trading partners, and both understood that participation in Mediterranean exchange was inseparable from the projection of power and the acquisition of the luxury goods that underwrote royal prestige. The Levantine city of Ugarit, sitting on the Syrian coast just south of modern Latakia, was perhaps the clearest embodiment of this connecting function. Ugarit's harbour served as a relay point where Aegean goods moving westward met Mesopotamian goods moving eastward, where Egyptians traded alongside merchants from Cyprus and Anatolia, where multiple writing systems, cuneiform, hieroglyphics, and the local alphabetic script that Ugarit itself helped develop, were used simultaneously by scribes recording transactions in a city that was effectively the Mediterranean's eastern clearinghouse. Byblos, further south on the Lebanese coast, had been shipping cedar timber to Egypt since the 3rd millennium BC, timber that the Nile Delta entirely lacked and that Egypt required for everything from furniture to warships. The relationship was so long-standing and so fundamental that the Egyptians called the city's harbour KBN and regarded its trade as a natural extension of their own economy. Cedar left Byblos, gold and faience arrived in return, and along those same routes moved not just commodities but cultural influence. Egyptian artistic motifs appear in Levantine ivories. Levantine alphabetic ideas filter into Egyptian administrative practice, and the exchange of prestige objects between royal courts, documented exhaustively in the Amarna tablets, meant that the elites of these different civilizations were, in a meaningful sense, participating in a shared material culture, even as they maintained distinct political identities. What the Eastern Mediterranean of the 2nd millennium BC reveals, when you look at all of it together, the Egyptian grain ports and diplomatic archives, the Hittite and Mitanni correspondence, the relay function of Ugarit, the cedar trade at Byblos, is that the sea was operating as a political technology long before anyone theorized it as such. States that controlled coastal access commanded economic leverage. States that maintained relationships across the water could project influence far beyond their own borders. The writing systems and administrative methods that would eventually shape the entire trajectory of Western civilization were being refined, exchanged, and adapted through these networks, carried on ships whose crews probably thought of themselves as traders rather than the unwitting agents of a civilizational revolution. The sea was not the frontier of these kingdoms. It was the space between their conversations, busy, consequential, and already beginning to produce something that no single kingdom could have built alone. Among all the societies that shaped the ancient Mediterranean, one stands apart for the sheer audacity of the proposition it represents. While Egypt and the great Eastern kingdoms built their power on river systems, agricultural plains and continental reach, the Minoans of Crete built theirs on almost nothing but water and the willingness to cross it. Their story forces a fundamental question about how maritime civilization actually works, not as a consequence of territorial dominance, but as something that can grow from the sea itself, from the routes crossing it, and the harbours commanding access to those routes. Crete sits at the Mediterranean's crossroads with something close to geometric precision. It lies south of the Aegean, north of Libya, within sailing range of the Levantine coast to the east and the Greek mainland to the northwest. For any society with the ambition and the technology to exploit that position, the island was not a peripheral location, it was the hub of a wheel. The Minoans grasped this with a clarity that would define their civilization for centuries, and by approximately 2650 BC, what archaeologists classify as the early Minoan II period, Cretan merchants were already sailing masted ships capable of reaching Egypt, Syria, and the coasts of Anatolia. These were not casual coastal hops. They were deliberate, sustained voyages into the open Mediterranean, and they required navigation knowledge, shipbuilding technology, and the kind of institutional organization that makes repeated long-distance travel possible, rather than accidental. What drove them outward, in the first instance, was almost certainly necessity dressed up as ambition. Crete had agricultural land, but not in abundance. It had skilled craftspeople, but craftsmanship requires raw materials, and the island lacked the metals its workshops demanded. Copper and tin, the components of bronze, the era's defining industrial material, had to come from somewhere else. Cyprus offered copper. Tin arrived through networks that stretched far to the east and north. Without access to those imports, Minoan metalworking could not function, and without metalworking, the palace economy that organized Cretan society had no foundation. The sea was not optional. It was structural. By the Neopalatial period, roughly 1700 to 1450 BC, Minoan civilization had reached its most elaborate expression. The great palace centres, Knossos on the northern coast, Phaistos in the south, Malea and Zakros positioned to watch different approaches across the sea, were not simply royal residences. They were integrated economic institutions, drawing in agricultural surplus from the surrounding countryside, housing workshops that produced luxury goods, maintaining storage systems that could redistribute food and materials across the island, and coordinating the external trade on which everything depended. The palaces were, in a meaningful sense, the administrative infrastructure of a maritime economy. They existed because the sea existed, and because the sea could be turned into a supply chain. The physical evidence for Minoan external reach is remarkable in its distribution. Minoan pottery, metalwork and frescoes have been found across the eastern Mediterranean, from the Levantine coast to Egypt. The distinctive marine style of Minoan ceramic art, painted with octopuses, dolphins and seabirds in flowing naturalistic compositions, spread through the same networks that carried the goods themselves, which suggests that Minoan aesthetic culture was itself a kind of traded commodity, a signal of sophistication and connection that regional elites were willing to pay for. Egyptian records identify the islanders as Keftiu, and Egyptian tomb paintings from the reign of Thutmose III in the 15th century BC show Keftiu envoys arriving at court with characteristic Minoan objects, a visual record of diplomatic and commercial contact that reaches across two entirely different civilizations. Whether those envoys represented formal diplomatic missions or particularly prominent merchant relationships is a matter of interpretation, but the fact of the contact is not in doubt. This brings us to the concept that historians have used to describe Minoan power, and where the evidence demands careful handling. The term thalassocracy, sea empire, has been applied to Minoan Crete since antiquity, appearing in Thucydides' account of early Aegean history, where he credits Minos of Crete with the first naval dominion. The word is evocative, and the general proposition captures something real. Minoan Crete clearly commanded the Aegean exchange network during the Neopalatial period in a way that no other single polity could match. The harbour town of Komos on Crete's southern coast shows evidence of ships and cargoes moving through it at a scale consistent with organised, sustained maritime commerce. Minoan-influenced goods and artistic styles appear so widely across the Aegean islands and the eastern Mediterranean that some degree of coordinated commercial dominance seems to be the only explanation that fits the pattern. But a formal sea empire, in the sense of a political authority that controlled routes through naval enforcement, cannot be confirmed by current evidence. There is no surviving Minoan text that records a fleet deployment. There is no clear archaeological signature of military occupation imposed on other Aegean islands. The picture that emerges from the evidence is more accurately described as a commercial hegemony, a situation in which Cretan merchants, palace networks, and harbour infrastructure were so thoroughly embedded in Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean trade that competitors simply could not match the reach, the organisation, or the relationships the Minoans had already built. Whether that commercial dominance was backed by force, or whether it was purely a function of economic superiority and diplomatic cultivation, remains genuinely uncertain. Scholars who argue for a true Minoan thalassocracy, and those who see Cretan power as primarily economic and cultural, are both working from the same incomplete record. An intellectual honesty requires acknowledging that the ancient Greek sources drawing on oral traditions about Minos and his naval power were writing many centuries after the events they described. What the Minoans demonstrate, regardless of exactly how their dominance was organised, is a principle that would recur throughout Mediterranean history with remarkable consistency. That control of harbours and sea routes could generate wealth, influence, and political weight that rivaled or exceeded what large territorial empires could produce through conquest and administration alone. Crete never controlled vast continental territories. It never fielded the armies of Egypt or the Hittites. But at the height of the Neopalatial period, Cretan goods were circulating from the Levant to the Aegean, Cretan envoys were received at the Egyptian court, and Cretan artistic styles were shaping the visual language of cultures that had never seen the island. That is the achievement of a society that understood, earlier than almost anyone else, that the sea was not a barrier between places but a connection between them, and that whoever managed those connections most effectively held a form of power that geography alone could never grant. The Minoans would not hold that position indefinitely. Around 1450 BC, the palace centres collapsed under circumstances that remain debated: volcanic catastrophe, invasion, internal disruption, or some combination of forces that the archaeological record captures in destruction layers but cannot fully explain. What replaced them in the Aegean and across the eastern Mediterranean was a different kind of maritime power. But the template the Minoans had established, routes, harbours, exchange networks, palace organisation, did not disappear. It simply passed into other hands. When the Minoan system collapsed and the palace networks fell silent, the eastern Mediterranean entered a period of disruption so severe that historians have given it its own designation: the Late Bronze Age collapse. Empires that had dominated the region for centuries, the Hittites, Mycenaean Greece, the great coastal cities of the Levant, either disappeared entirely or contracted to shadows of their former scale. The precise causes remain contested, but the consequences were unambiguous. The elaborate long-distance exchange networks that had carried copper, tin, grain, and luxury goods across the sea simply stopped functioning at the scale they once had. The connected world of the Bronze Age went quiet. Into that silence the Phoenicians sailed. The Phoenician city-states, Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, Berytus, occupied a narrow coastal strip along the Levant, hemmed between the sea to the west and the mountains of Lebanon to the east. Like the Minoans before them, this geography was not a constraint so much as a clarification. The land could not sustain imperial ambitions, but the sea could sustain something arguably more durable. A commercial network so extensive and so deeply embedded in the economic life of the Mediterranean that it would shape the region for centuries and leave traces in human culture that persist to this day. Between roughly 1200 and 800 BC, and continuing well beyond, the Phoenicians built a maritime system of approximately 300 coastal outposts stretching from the Levantine shoreline all the way to the western reaches of the sea, touching Cyprus, Sardinia, the Balearic Islands, Sicily, Malta, and the northwest African coast. This was not empire in the traditional sense. It was something more flexible and in many ways more resilient, a web of ports, trading relationships, and shared commercial practices that could absorb disruption in one area without collapsing the whole. The goods that moved through this network reflected the particular genius of the Phoenician economic model. From their home cities came cedar timber, which was among the most prized construction material in the ancient world, and which the treeless civilizations of Egypt and Mesopotamia had sought for millennia. Alongside timber moved Tyrian purple dye, extracted from the murex sea snail in a process so labour-intensive and so distinctive in colour that the dye became synonymous with royalty and extreme wealth across the ancient Mediterranean. Phoenician glassware and metalwork travelled westward. In the opposite direction flowed silver from Sardinia and Iberia, in quantities that effectively made the Phoenicians the primary conduit through which Western Mediterranean mineral wealth entered the broader ancient economy. Tin, crucial for bronze production and sourced from mines as distant as Galicia or Britain, moved through the same channels. The merchant vessels that carried these cargoes were built for serious commercial work, capable of carrying between 100 and 500 tons of cargo, constructed with the advanced mortise and tenon hull joints that gave Phoenician shipbuilding a structural strength suited to open-sea voyaging. By the 7th century BC, Phoenician mariners were sailing baraimes and early triremes, vessels that combined carrying capacity with enough manoeuvrability to navigate the complex coastal geography of the Western Mediterranean with reliability rather than recklessness. The crown of this entire system was Carthage, founded by Tyrian merchants. The most widely accepted date is around 814 BC, though ancient sources place the event as early as 1215 BC, and scholars continue to debate the precise timeline. Carthage occupied a peninsula on the northwest African coast with a natural harbour that seemed almost designed for commercial dominance. It commanded the narrow strait between Sicily and Tunisia, through which virtually all sea traffic between the eastern and western Mediterranean had to pass. A city positioned there was not merely participating in Mediterranean trade, it was sitting astride the trade's central artery. Carthage grew accordingly. By 300 BC it controlled the coast of northwest Africa, Sicily, Sardinia, the Balearic Islands, and Iberia, and its population may have reached somewhere between 500,000 and 700,000 inhabitants, a metropolis by ancient standards, rivaling anything the Mediterranean world could produce. What had begun as a trading colony had become the western hub of a commercial empire, the node through which the entire Phoenician network's western half was organized and administered. Recent ancient DNA research has added an important nuance to our understanding of how this expansion actually worked. The genetic evidence suggests that Punic populations in the Western Mediterranean showed only limited Levantine ancestry, indicating that Phoenician colonization was not primarily a process of population displacement. It involved substantial integration with local communities, intermarriage, cultural exchange, gradual absorption of indigenous peoples, into a Phoenician commercial framework rather than their replacement by transplanted Levantines. This matters because it reframes what Phoenician colonization was. It was not the projection of a single ethnic or political identity across space. It was the extension of a commercial and cultural system that proved flexible enough to absorb new people and new contexts while maintaining the connectivity that gave it its value. That flexibility is nowhere more apparent than in the Phoenicians' most consequential contribution to the history of human communication. Around 1050 BC, Phoenician merchants devised a 22-letter consonantal alphabet, a writing system of breathtaking economy compared to the elaborate syllabaries and logographic scripts that preceded it. Where cuneiform and hieroglyphics required years of specialist training to master, the Phoenician alphabet could be learned in weeks. This was not an accident of cultural achievement detached from commercial life. It was a practical technology for a trading civilization that needed records, contracts, correspondence, and inventories across dozens of ports and hundreds of relationships simultaneously. The alphabet was infrastructure, as surely as a harbour or a ship, and like a harbour, it spread. Greek merchants encountered it through commercial contact in the 8th century BC, adapted it to their own phonological needs by adding vowels, and transmitted it westward and northward into the writing systems that would eventually become Latin, and much later, Cyrillic. The script you're reading now carries the genetic inheritance of Phoenician merchants, recording cargo manifests on the eastern Mediterranean coast more than 3,000 years ago. This is what makes the Phoenician achievement so difficult to overstate when considering Mediterranean history as a connected system, rather than a succession of discrete empires. The Minoans had demonstrated that maritime commerce could generate power and wealth without territorial conquest. The Phoenicians took that insight and operationalized it at a scale, and with a permanence the Minoans never achieved. They turned the Mediterranean into something genuinely new, a connected economic space in which goods, techniques, written language, and cultural forms moved continuously from shore to shore, carried by merchant ships through a network of ports that spanned the entire basin. No single city commanded that network in the way Rome would later command its empire, but the network itself became the organizing reality of Mediterranean life, setting the terms on which every subsequent civilization, Greek, Carthaginian, Roman, would have to operate. The sea was no longer simply a body of water between places. The Phoenicians had made it a system. What came next was the struggle over who would govern it. The Phoenicians had made the sea a system. The Greeks, arriving into that system as participants before becoming its most energetic reformers, would transform it into something else entirely, a networked civilization in which the sea was not merely the medium of commerce, but the very condition of political and intellectual life. The geography made this almost inevitable. The Aegean basin is one of the most fragmented maritime environments on Earth, a shattered landscape of approximately 3,600 islands, of which around 200 are permanently inhabited, embedded in a coastline so deeply indented with peninsulas, gulfs, and natural harbours that almost no settlement in the Greek world sat more than a short journey from the water. There was no Greek heartland of the kind that might sustain a centralized agrarian empire, no Nile valley to concentrate surplus and administrative power in a single authority. What the landscape produced instead was a proliferation of independent city-states, polis, each occupying its own coastal niche, each developing its own institutions and identity, and each compelled by the limits of its own territory to look outward across the water for the grain, metal, timber, and markets that survival required. The sea did not merely connect the Greek world, it constituted it. Fragmentation on land produced dependence on the water, and dependence on the water produced a civilization that was at its core a maritime phenomenon. What the Greeks did with that dependence, beginning around 750 BC and accelerating through the following 2.5 centuries, was extraordinary in both scale and consequence. Facing population pressure, land scarcity, and the political tensions that came with both, Greek city-states began sending out organized expeditions to establish new settlements along the coasts of the wider Mediterranean and the approaches to the Black Sea. These were not casual migrations, they were deliberate acts of political and commercial projection, apoikiai meaning roughly homes away from home, in which a founding city retained cultural and religious ties to the new settlement while the colony developed its own civic institutions. By the end of the Archaic period, somewhere between 150 and 300 such colonies had been established across an arc of coastline stretching from the western Aegean to the shores of the Black Sea, from the heel of Italy and the Straits of Sicily westward to the coasts of southern France and the Iberian Peninsula. Cumae, founded near modern Naples, was among the earliest in the west. Syracuse in Sicily became one of the most powerful cities in the ancient world. Massalia, present-day Marseille, planted the seeds of urban life in what would become France. Naucratis in Egypt operated as a regulated Greek trading post within the orbit of the pharaohs. Together these colonies transformed the Mediterranean from a Phoenician-dominated commercial space into a Greek-inflected one, layering new relationships, new rivalries, and new cultural energies across the basin's entire breadth. The economics driving this expansion were inseparable from the sea's practical geography. Greek colonies along the Black Sea approaches, established by Milesians, Megarians, and Ionians, existed in large part to secure grain supplies for cities back in the Aegean, where arable land could not feed growing urban populations. The tribute and trade networks that flowed from these eastern connections were the material foundation on which Athenian power was eventually built. Meanwhile, silver from the mines at Laurion in Attica provided the economic fuel for naval ambition in a more direct sense. When the Laurion veins yielded approximately 100 talents in 484 to 483 BC, the statesman Themistocles persuaded the Athenians not to distribute this windfall among the citizen body, but to invest it in warships. Athens grew from a naval minnow of perhaps 20 to 30 triremes in 499 BC to a fleet of around 100 triremes by 483 BC, and roughly 200 by the time the Persian fleet appeared at Salamis in 480 BC. The silver of Laurion had become the keels and rams of an empire in formation. That naval rivalry was inseparable from the political character of the Greek world, because power in the Mediterranean was naval power, and because no single polis could permanently dominate the others by land alone. The Greek city-states existed in a condition of perpetual competitive tension that was simultaneously a source of extraordinary violence and extraordinary creativity. Athens challenged Aegina, Corinth, and eventually Sparta not merely for territory, but for control of sea lanes, tribute networks, and the commercial relationships on which urban life depended. The Delian League, which Athens transformed from a defensive alliance against Persia into an instrument of Athenian imperial extraction, was at its foundation a naval organization, a collective of maritime states paying tribute into an Athenian-administered treasury in exchange for the protection of Athenian triremes. What looked like an alliance was, in practice, a monetized sea power system, and the Athenians were under no illusions about what held it together. As Thucydides would later have the Athenian envoys say at Melos, "The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must." But those words were spoken by a civilization that was, in the same breath, producing Sophocles, Plato, and the Parthenon. That conjunction, ruthless maritime competition, and extraordinary intellectual and artistic flourishing, was not a contradiction. It was a product of the same conditions. The mobility that Greek sea dependence demanded created a world in which ideas travelled as readily as amphorae of olive oil. The same colonial networks that carried grain back to the Aegean carried the Greek alphabet westward, where the Cumaean variant was adopted by the Etruscans and subsequently evolved into the Latin script that underlies virtually all Western written languages today. The same competitive culture that drove Athenian naval investment produced the institutional innovations, democratic deliberation, public argument, accountability to a citizen body, that would become the foundational vocabulary of Western political thought. Philosophy, tragedy, history as a systematic inquiry into human events. These were not products of a civilization that happened to live near the sea. They were products of a civilization that the sea had made restless, mobile, outward-looking, and accustomed to encountering difference and having to reason through it. The Greek Mediterranean was, in the end, a networked civilization rather than an empire, and that distinction mattered enormously. It had no single capital, no unified army, no shared legal code enforced from a central administration. What it had was connectivity, hundreds of ports linked by common language, shared religious practices, recognizable artistic conventions, and the ongoing argument about justice, governance, and the good life that moved through those ports as surely as any traded commodity. The sea was the infrastructure of that argument. Every ship that crossed the Aegean carrying colonists, merchants, or ideas was also carrying the accumulated experiment of a civilization, working out what it meant to live together in conditions of scarcity, competition, and irreducible plurality. The Greeks never resolved that argument among themselves, but they left it as an inheritance for every civilization that came after, and the next power to inherit the Mediterranean would attempt to resolve it not through philosophy but through conquest. The power that would inherit the Greek Mediterranean did not arrive from within it. It descended from a peninsula to the northwest, built on agrarian discipline and infantry dominance, and for much of its early history it regarded the sea with suspicion rather than ambition. But between the mid-3rd century BC and the opening decades of the 2nd, Rome and Carthage would fight 3 wars that settled once and for all the question the Greeks had never answered. Who commands the sea commands the world. Carthage was already old when Rome was still consolidating its grip on Italy. Founded by Phoenician settlers from Tyre, the city on the North African coast had grown into the Western Mediterranean's dominant maritime power, inheriting the Phoenician genius for trade routes and naval logistics and extending it across a territorial arc of remarkable breadth. By the 3rd century BC, Carthaginian influence spanned the Balearic Islands, Corsica, Sardinia, the coastal regions of southern Iberia, and the western coastline of Sicily, an empire not of occupation in the Roman sense but of strategic position, built on the control of ports, straits, and the commercial lanes running between them. Where the Phoenicians had been pioneers threading new routes through unknown waters, Carthage had become a system of power organized around the Mediterranean's central geometry. That geometry made conflict almost inevitable. The Western Mediterranean is not a large space, and it has a fulcrum. Sicily, the largest island in the sea, sits precisely where the basin narrows between the Italian peninsula and the North African coast, dividing the waters into eastern and western halves and commanding the passage between them. Whoever held Sicily and its ports held the logistical spine of Mediterranean trade and military projection. Carthage had understood this for centuries, which is why it had spent generations contesting the island with the Greek cities of its eastern half, Syracuse above all, in a grinding sequence of campaigns that left western Sicily firmly within Carthaginian hands and the eastern half stubbornly independent. The island was a permanent frontier, a pressure point, and when a local crisis at the city of Messana in 264 BC gave Rome an invitation to intervene, the pressure broke the surface. The First Punic War was, in one sense, an accident of opportunism. A mercenary garrison in Messana appealed to both Rome and Carthage for support, and Rome crossed the Strait of Messina with an army, triggering a conflict that neither power had fully planned but neither could afford to lose. What made the war extraordinary was what Rome did next. It was not a naval power. It had no tradition of deep-water fleet operations, no corps of experienced oarsmen, no doctrine for fighting at sea. Carthage, by contrast, was the supreme maritime force in the western Mediterranean, and its quinqueremes, 5-bank oared warships of considerable speed and manoeuvrability, were the product of centuries of accumulated expertise. The rational prediction, at the war's outset, was Carthaginian naval dominance and Roman frustration. Rome declined to accept that prediction. Around 260 BC, working from a captured Carthaginian quinquereme as a template, Roman shipyards reportedly produced a fleet of 100 quinqueremes and 30 triremes in approximately 60 days, a feat of industrial organization that says as much about Roman administrative capacity as about their naval ambition. But the ships alone could not close the gap in seamanship, so Roman engineers solved the problem differently. They invented the corvus, a rotating boarding bridge fitted with a heavy spike that could be dropped onto an enemy deck, locking the two vessels together and turning a naval engagement into the kind of infantry fight Roman soldiers knew how to win. At the Battle of Mylae in 260 BC, this innovation delivered Rome its first major naval victory, transforming the tactical logic of Mediterranean warfare in a single afternoon. The sea could be conquered not on its own terms but on Rome's. The war ground on for 23 years, with losses on both sides that modern scholarship struggles to fully comprehend. Ancient sources, including Polybius, cite combined troop and fleet figures in the hundreds of thousands, though historians rightly treat the precise numbers with caution. When it ended in 241 BC, Rome had won, and the prize was Sicily entire. The island became Rome's first overseas province, a model for what Roman imperialism would repeatedly produce. A conquered territory reorganized as a tributary supplier of grain, silver, and manpower for the Italian core. Sicily's agricultural output would feed Roman armies and Roman cities for generations. The first step toward Mare Nostrum had been taken not by ambition alone, but by the ruthless recognition that Mediterranean power was inseparable from the islands and straits at its centre. The Second Punic War, which began in 218 BC and consumed the Mediterranean world for 17 years, elevated the stakes to an entirely different register. Hannibal's crossing of the Alps was an act of strategic audacity that nearly unravelled everything Rome had built. The shock of Trebia, Lake Trasimene, and above all Cannae, where Roman casualties may have reached 60 to 70,000 dead in a single engagement, left Rome in a position of existential vulnerability that no previous enemy had achieved. But through all of it, Rome held something Hannibal could not replace: naval control of the central Mediterranean. Roman bases on Sicily, Malta, and the Egadi Islands gave the Republic the ability to supply its forces, interdict Carthaginian reinforcement, and, decisively, to project power toward Africa when the moment came. The capture of New Carthage in Iberia in 209 BC under Scipio Africanus delivered not only a strategic port but access to silver mines, producing roughly 300 pounds of silver daily, funding the war's final phase at Carthaginian expense. The Battle of Zama in 202 BC ended it. Hannibal, recalled to Africa and deprived of the cavalry superiority that had made him invincible in Italy, was defeated on ground that favoured Roman discipline. The treaty that followed stripped Carthage of everything: all overseas territories, all but 10 of its warships, a reparations burden of 10,000 talents of silver stretched across 50 years, and any independent right to wage war. What had been the Mediterranean's most formidable naval empire was reduced within a generation to a landlocked tributary. A third brief conflict in 149 to 146 BC erased even that remnant, leaving Carthage a ruined city and Rome without a rival in any direction the sea could carry a ship. What the Punic Wars established was not merely Roman military superiority, but a new principle of Mediterranean order. Command of the sea was no longer a commercial or strategic advantage to be contested among equals. It was the precondition of empire itself, the mechanism by which a single political will could be projected across the basin's entire breadth, from the Pillars of Hercules to the Levantine shore. Rome had learned this lesson the hard way, by nearly losing, and it would not forget it. The Mediterranean was about to become something it had never been in the 5,000 years of recorded history before, a single political arena, administered, taxed, and ultimately named after the power that controlled every coastline it touched. The name came first as a boast and hardened into a fact. Mare Nostrum, our sea. Romans began using the phrase after the Punic Wars, and in the decades that followed they proceeded to make it literally true in a way no power before them had managed, and none after them would repeat for more than 1,000 years. By 30 BC, when Octavian's defeat of Antony and Cleopatra at Actium and his subsequent annexation of Egypt closed the last gap in Rome's territorial perimeter, the Mediterranean had become something entirely without historical precedent. A single inland lake controlled from shore to shore by one state, one law, and one administrative system. Every coastline the sea touched, from the Atlantic straits of Hispania to the Levantine ports of Syria, from the Gallic harbours of Massalia to the Egyptian grain wharves of Alexandria, answered to Rome. No rival navy existed. No competing empire held so much as a defensible stretch of coastline. The Mediterranean, for the first and last time in its history, belonged entirely to one people. That monopoly endured for roughly 4 centuries, from the consolidation under Augustus to the effective collapse of Roman authority in the western provinces during the 5th century. The sea remained what Rome had declared it, an internal corridor of empire rather than a contested frontier. The consequences of that continuity were enormous and reached far beyond military logistics. The instrument of Roman naval power was professional, systematic, and enormous in scale. Augustus founded the imperial fleet at Misenum on the Bay of Naples around 27 BC, and a second fleet was established at Ravenna to cover the Adriatic. By the time of the Tetrarchy, the combined naval establishment stretched across a series of regional squadrons and numbered roughly 45,000 sailors. A standing maritime force maintained not for conquest, which was largely complete, but for patrol, piracy suppression, and the protection of commercial sea lanes. That last function was perhaps the most transformative. Mediterranean piracy, which had reached crisis levels in the 1st century BC, and had prompted the Roman Senate to grant Pompey an unprecedented command over the entire sea and its surrounding territories through the Lex Gabinia of 67 BC, was effectively eliminated within a generation. Pompey's 3-month campaign cleared the sea lanes with methodical efficiency, and the Pax Romana that followed maintained those lanes in a condition of relative safety that Mediterranean merchants had never previously enjoyed and would not enjoy again for centuries after Rome's fall. Safe seas meant reliable commerce at a scale that still impresses. The logistical centerpiece of the Roman Mediterranean was the Annona, the imperial grain supply system that fed the city of Rome and provisioned its armies. Egypt and North Africa had been the granaries of the ancient world long before Roman conquest, but under imperial administration their output was organized into a regular convoy system of extraordinary capacity. By the 1st century AD, the fleet could move up to 20 million modi of wheat annually, roughly 170 million litres, from Egyptian and African ports to the docks at Ostia and the purpose-built harbour at Portus, which Claudius began and Trajan expanded into a hexagonal basin, capable of berthing 200 ships simultaneously. The engineering of Portus alone, carved from the marshy flatlands north of Ostia's mouth at the Tiber, represented a capital investment in maritime infrastructure that expressed something fundamental about how Rome understood its relationship to the sea, not as a natural endowment to be passively used, but as a system to be engineered, controlled, and optimized. That engineering impulse ran throughout the Roman Mediterranean. The imperial road network, the VIOE, extended to every major port, linking Ostia, Puteoli, Carthage, Alexandria, and Antioch into a single information and logistics grid in which the movement of goods, troops, and administrative correspondence could be planned, timed, and tracked. Lighthouses marked dangerous headlands and harbour entrances. The pharaohs of Alexandria remained the most famous, but dozens of smaller lights along the Italian, Gallic, Hispanic, and African coasts served the same function, reducing the seasonal constraint of Mediterranean navigation and extending the effective sailing calendar. Fortified harbours and naval shipyards, Misenum above all, the home base of the Western Fleet, provided permanent infrastructure for fleet maintenance and repair. The sea was not merely used by this system, it was integrated into it, made a component of a continental administrative machine. Roman maritime law gave that machine its commercial language. The lex rhodia, drawn from earlier Greek maritime custom, but formalized into Roman jurisprudence, established the principle of general average, the shared apportionment of losses when cargo was jettisoned to save a ship, creating a uniform commercial framework that made long-distance maritime insurance and partnership contracts legally predictable across the entire basin. Diocletian's Edict of Maximum Prices in 301 AD fixed freight rates with imperial authority, specifying, for instance, a rate of 16 denarii per modius for grain shipped from Alexandria to Rome, standardizing the cost of distance trade in a way that allowed merchants to calculate profit margins across voyages of hundreds of miles with legal certainty. These were not merely administrative details. They were the bones of a commercial legal culture that would survive the empire that created them, passing through Byzantine jurisprudence and medieval maritime codes into the foundations of European commercial law. The physical and legal infrastructure reinforced each other to produce something remarkable, a Mediterranean economy that was, for its era, genuinely integrated. Amphorae produced in Hispanian workshops turn up in excavations from Syria to Britain. Egyptian papyrus reached libraries in Gaul. Garum, the fermented fish sauce produced along the North African and Iberian coasts, was a condiment consumed in Roman households from the Rhine to the Euphrates. The scale and density of this material exchange, traceable now through the archaeology of shipwrecks, ceramic distributions, and ancient price data, reflects an economy where the sea had ceased to be a barrier or even simply a highway, and had become, in effect, the connective tissue of a civilization. When the Western Empire finally fragmented in the 5th century, what was lost was not merely political authority, but the entire infrastructure of integrated movement. The fleet patrols, the Annona convoys, the road connections to functioning ports, the legal predictability of maritime contracts enforced by imperial courts. This sea did not disappear. Trade did not stop. But the integrated system that had made Mare Nostrum a working reality dissolved, and the fragmentation of coastline control that followed would define Mediterranean history for the next several centuries. What persisted, and what makes Rome's maritime achievement genuinely foundational, rather than merely impressive, was the memory and the legal residue. The phrase Mare Nostrum itself survived Rome, revived by every later power that dreamed of restoring what Rome had built, from Justinian's generals reconquering North Africa in the 6th century, to Mussolini invoking it with hollow grandiosity in the 20th. That persistence reveals something important. Rome had not only controlled the Mediterranean, it had established the idea that the Mediterranean could and should be controlled as a unified whole, that its coastlines and sea lanes formed a single political and commercial system rather than a collection of separate shores. That idea outlasted every harbour Rome built, every road it paved, every shipyard it founded. It entered Western political memory as a standard, partial, idealized, and never quite achieved again, against which every subsequent Mediterranean power would measure itself and find the sea a little larger than it had expected. The collapse of Roman authority in the western provinces did not arrive as a single catastrophic moment, but as a slow erosion of the system that had made Mare Nostrum function. When Adussa deposed the last Western emperor Romulus Augustulus in 476 CE, he was not toppling a structure still at full strength. He was formalizing the disappearance of something that had already been hollowing out for decades. The western coastlines, once woven together by Roman law, Roman fleets and Roman grain convoys, now answered to a patchwork of Germanic successor kingdoms: Visigoths in Hispania and southern Gaul, Vandals in North Africa, Ostrogoths moving toward Italy. The unified shore became an archipelago of competing authorities, each holding a stretch of coastline without the institutional means to integrate it with the others. Yet the Eastern Roman Empire survived. This is the fact that tends to get buried under the drama of Rome's western fall, and it is essential. Constantinople remained standing, administratively functional, and, critically, still in command of a navy. The Eastern Empire, which history would come to call Byzantium, retained the Anatolian coast, the Balkan provinces, Egypt and the Levant. For more than a century after 476, the eastern basin of the Mediterranean remained under the kind of continuous imperial governance that had built Rome's commercial network in the first place. The emperor in Constantinople still collected taxes, maintained shipyards, and enforced maritime law. The ports of Alexandria, Antioch, and Constantinople itself continued to function as nodes of long-distance trade. The administrative machine had not died. It had retreated eastward and contracted around its most productive heartland. Justinian, ruling from 527 to 565, made the most ambitious attempt to reverse the fragmentation. His general Belisarius crossed to North Africa in 533 and dismantled the Vandal kingdom within 2 years, recovering Carthage for the empire. Italy followed, in a grinding 2-decade campaign against the Ostrogoths that left the peninsula exhausted but nominally reunited under imperial authority. Parts of southern Spain were briefly reclaimed. The Mediterranean looked for a moment in the mid-6th century as though it might reconstitute itself as something resembling the old Roman system, a single legal and commercial framework spanning most of the coastline. That moment was real but brief. The plague of Justinian, which struck Constantinople in 541 and rippled outward across the basin for the following 2 centuries in successive waves, cut population, disrupted agriculture, strained military capacity, and made the administrative machinery of reconquest impossible to sustain. The Western reconquests began unravelling within decades of Justinian's death. What replaced unified Roman control was not chaos. The word overstates the disorder, but fragmentation. The Mediterranean shifted from a Roman lake into something more like a contested zone, its surface divided by new political and military frontiers that cut across old trade routes and reshaped the geography of movement. The Vandals had already demonstrated what control of the North African coast meant in practice. They used it to raid Sicily and Italy, sacking Rome itself in 455 and to interrupt the grain supply lines that had been the metabolic core of the Western Empire. Once those supply lines were broken by political fragmentation rather than temporary military disruption, the populations dependent on them, above all the city of Rome, which shrank from perhaps 1 million inhabitants in the imperial peak to perhaps 20 or 30,000 by the 7th century, found themselves permanently reduced. The sea was the same body of water it had always been, but without the institutional framework to organize movement across it, proximity to the coast no longer guaranteed connection to the wider world. Ports and cities did not simply disappear. This is the counter-narrative to any simple story of decline, and it matters. Constantinople remained one of the largest and most commercially active cities on earth throughout the 5th, 6th, and 7th centuries, a hub through which silk from China, spices from the Indian Ocean, grain from Anatolia, and luxury goods from across the known world continued to flow. Antioch, even after being devastated by Persian forces and earthquake, retained its role as a junction between the Mediterranean and the overland routes of the Levant. Alexandria, the greatest port of the ancient world after Rome itself, continued to export Egyptian grain eastward to Constantinople after the Western supply system collapsed. What changed was not the existence of ports, but the density of the connections between them, the degree to which a merchant sailing from one shore could expect predictable legal protection, standardized weights and measures, and safe sea lanes on the other side. And then, within a single decade in the mid-7th century, the political geography of the entire eastern basin transformed with a speed that no contemporary observer could fully have anticipated. Islamic Arab forces, energized by the new faith that had unified the Arabian Peninsula under the Prophet Muhammad's successors, moved north and west out of Arabia with extraordinary military momentum. At the Battle of Yarmouk in 636, they destroyed the Byzantine field army in Syria and seized the Levantine coast. By 639 to 642, Egypt had fallen. Alexandria, the great Mediterranean metropolis, passing out of Roman and Christian hands for the first time in nearly 1,000 years. The coastlines that Byzantine fleets had patrolled, the ports through which the Eastern commercial system had circulated goods for centuries, were now in different hands, answering to a different religion, a different law, and a different political centre of gravity. The sea that had been Mare Nostrum was now something harder to name and harder to control. A military and naval frontier ran roughly from the Anatolian coast to the Syrian one, and across that frontier a new arms race was already developing. Byzantine Greek fire, the incendiary weapon deployed with devastating effect against Arab fleets, against the growing maritime ambitions of the Umayyad Caliphate. The Byzantine theme system reorganized the remaining imperial provinces into military districts designed for sustained defense rather than imperial expansion, signaling a fundamental psychological and institutional shift. Rome's heirs were now thinking about how to hold a boundary, not how to govern a whole. The divided sea was not a dead sea. Trade, culture, and people continued to cross it, as they always had, because geography does not honour political frontiers and the human need for exchange is older than any empire. But the nature of that crossing had changed. Where Rome had made the Mediterranean a single system, the post-Roman centuries were making it a border, a place where different worlds met, negotiated, and sometimes fought, rather than a space through which a single civilization moved freely. That border was about to become something far more consequential, as the young Islamic civilization consolidated its hold on the southern and eastern shores, and began to build something Rome had never imagined, a maritime commercial network rooted not in military conquest, but in the expansive logic of faith, law, and trade. What emerged on the southern and eastern shores of the Mediterranean in the century following the Arab conquests was not simply a new political order imposed on top of the old. It was something more interesting, a civilizational re-engineering of the sea itself, carried out through commerce, agriculture, and naval competition simultaneously, transforming the geography of wealth and knowledge in ways that would shape European history for centuries to come. The scale of Arab maritime ambition was rapid and enormous. Muawiyah I, governor of Syria before he became the first Umayyad caliph, understood almost immediately that control of the Mediterranean coastline meant nothing without the ability to project power across its surface. By 648 to 650 CE, he had assembled a fleet estimated at around 1,700 ships for the conquest of Cyprus, a figure that historians treat as an approximate indicator of capacity rather than a precise count, but which signals the sheer organizational reach of the new caliphate regardless of exact numbers. Cyprus fell, then Rhodes, then raids extended towards Sicily. The defining confrontation came in 655 at the Battle of the Masts, fought off the Lycian coast, where a Muslim fleet engaged the Byzantine armada of the Emperor Constans II and defeated it decisively. The eastern Mediterranean, which Byzantium had held as an internal sea for centuries, was suddenly contested in both directions. Two naval powers now faced each other across the same water, each capable of striking the other's coastlines, neither capable of eliminating the other. What followed was not a clean Islamic takeover of the sea, but something far more dynamic, a long oscillation of raid, counter-raid, commercial negotiation, and technological exchange across a military frontier that was never fully closed. Byzantine shipwrights and Arab engineers absorbed each other's innovations. The Arab navies that Muawiyah built drew heavily on Coptic shipwrights in Egypt. Craftsmen whose knowledge of Mediterranean hull construction was centuries deep, blending Byzantine dromon designs with Arab engineering sensibilities into a hybrid naval tradition. When the Umayyad fleet besieged Constantinople itself in 717 to 718, assembling somewhere in the range of 1,800 ships, the attack ultimately failed, defeated partly by Byzantine Greek fire, partly by Bulgarian intervention. But the campaign illustrated how thoroughly the sea had become a shared and contested zone, rather than the domain of any single power. By the early 8th century, the Islamic world controlled roughly 3/4 of the Mediterranean coastline. This was not merely a military or political fact. It was an economic transformation of the First Order. The ports of Alexandria, Acre, and the Levantine coast, which had been the joints connecting the Indian Ocean trade networks to the Mediterranean since antiquity, now operated within a single Islamic commercial and legal framework that stretched from the coasts of Spain and Morocco all the way to Persia and beyond. Silk travelled from China through Central Asian overland routes, or across the Indian Ocean and into the Red Sea, landing at Egyptian ports, and moving from there to Venetian and Byzantine merchants who distributed it northward into European markets. Spices from the Indonesian archipelago, pepper from India, fine cotton, and dyes from across the Islamic world. All of this flowed through the same networks, carried by merchants whose operations were documented in astonishing detail in the Cairo Geniza, the archive of documents preserved in a Cairo synagogue that gives historians a granular picture of medieval Mediterranean commerce. Fatimid Egypt maintained active trading relationships with the Italian city-states of Amalfi and Genoa, commercial partnerships that cut straight across the religious frontier because profit is a more reliable organizer of human behavior than ideology. But the deepest transformation was agricultural, and it reshaped the Mediterranean world in ways that outlasted every dynasty and every fleet. The phenomenon historians call the Arab agricultural revolution was not the invention of farming. It was the systematic transfer of crops, irrigation technologies, and agronomic knowledge across the full breadth of the Islamic world, from its easternmost reaches in South and Southeast Asia, all the way to the Atlantic shores of Al-Andalus. Sugar cane, rice, cotton, hard wheat, citrus fruits, melons, spinach, eggplant, approximately 18 crops in total were introduced or dramatically expanded across the Mediterranean basin during this period, drawing on origins in Africa, India and China. Enhanced irrigation systems, the Sakia water wheel, the Noria, the underground canal channels, allowed these crops to be cultivated on land that had previously supported only seasonal agriculture, extending the growing season and enabling double and sometimes triple cropping in Egypt and the Iberian Peninsula. Agronomic knowledge was codified in texts like Ibn Battal's Duwan al-Filaha, practical farming manuals written in Arabic that represented a tradition of empirical observation and systematic land management without precedent in the earlier Mediterranean world. Some historians note that certain of these crops, rice and sugarcane among them, had a presence in parts of the Mediterranean before the Arab period, which complicates any claim of outright introduction. What the Arab agricultural system unambiguously achieved, however, was the scaling, systematization and geographic spread of these crops into regions and at densities that transformed the nutritional base, the urban growth and the dietary culture of the entire basin. Cities in Al-Andalus and in Egypt grew partly because their agricultural hinterlands could now support larger, more diverse populations. The Mediterranean diet was being rewritten in real time, and the ingredients of that rewriting, citrus groves, rice paddies, sugar plantations, were direct products of the Islamic world's capacity to move biological and technical knowledge across vast distances. What this period was not, despite the weight of later historical mythology, was a civilizational rupture that severed European culture from its ancient roots. Trade across the religious frontier continued throughout. Byzantine merchants purchased Islamic goods. Italian city-states negotiated directly with Fatimid rulers. The Silk Road's western terminus was Mediterranean, and the goods that arrived there circulated northward into markets that would eventually feed the commercial ambitions of Venice and Genoa. The knowledge travelled too: mathematical systems, astronomical instruments, pharmaceutical knowledge, philosophical texts, moving through translation and through the human traffic of a sea that never fully closed itself to movement, regardless of the political borders drawn across its map. What the Islamic transformation of the Mediterranean actually produced was a more complex economic geography than Rome had ever built. Not a single unified empire managing a single lake, but a web of overlapping networks, rival powers, and cross-cultural commercial relationships threading through the same sea. The frontier between Byzantium and the Islamic world was real, militarily serious, and sometimes violent. It was also, simultaneously, one of the most productive zones of exchange in the medieval world, carrying goods, crops, technologies, and ideas in multiple directions at once. The sea had always been an engine of encounter. It had simply found a new and more intricate way to run. That web of overlapping networks, Byzantine, Islamic, and the tentative commercial tendrils of the Italian city-states, was about to be detonated by an event nobody had planned for its economic consequences. When Pope Urban II called the First Crusade at Clermont in 1095, he was not thinking about convoy systems or letters of credit or the price of pepper in the Rialto markets. But the merchant republics of the Italian peninsula were thinking about exactly those things, and they understood almost immediately that the crusading movement represented something they had never encountered before: a guaranteed, permanent surge of military and pilgrim traffic across the eastern Mediterranean, and with it, an opportunity to convert religious war into commercial infrastructure that might last for centuries. Venice, Genoa and Pisa were not, by the time of the First Crusade, young or untested powers. Each had already carved out trading relationships along the Byzantine coast, negotiated privileges with Islamic rulers when the price was right, and developed the shipbuilding capacity to move substantial cargo across the sea. What the Crusades gave them was leverage. Crusader armies needed transport. Pilgrims needed passage. Newly established Crusader states in the Levant needed supply lines, garrison resupply, and naval protection against a hostile coastline. The republics provided all of these things, and they charged accordingly, not merely in coin but in something more durable: territorial rights, tax exemptions, and guaranteed trading quarters in the ports that mattered most. The results were structural in a way that survived the Crusades themselves by centuries. Venice, particularly after the catastrophic Fourth Crusade of 1204 redirected its forces toward Constantinople, assembled a maritime empire of exceptional strategic coherence. Corfu and Crete fell into Venetian hands in the early 13th century, giving the Republic control over the sea lanes linking the Adriatic to the Aegean and the Aegean to the Levantine ports. Venetian fondaci, fortified warehouses and residential compounds, were established across the eastern Mediterranean from Acre to Alexandria, functioning as semi-sovereign commercial enclaves within otherwise hostile or foreign jurisdictions. Genoa matched this with a different but equally deliberate geography, pushing into the Black Sea to seize the colony of Caffa on the Crimean coast and the quarter of Galata directly across the Golden Horn from Constantinople, giving Genoese merchants direct access to the overland routes that carried Central Asian goods westward. Pisa operated with less territorial ambition but compensated with diplomatic skill, securing trade privileges in Jaffa and the Balearic Islands through Crusader grants, inserting itself into the pressure points of eastern Mediterranean commerce wherever a foothold could be purchased or negotiated. The sheer volume of Crusader-era traffic forced these three republics into something they had historically resisted: coordination. When pilgrims and armies moved in mass convoys across contested water, piracy became catastrophic for everyone. In 1218, Venice and Genoa signed a treaty obligating each to patrol against piracy threatening the other's merchant shipping, a remarkable agreement between cities that were simultaneously bitter commercial rivals and occasional military enemies. In 1229, Pisa and Venice negotiated a non-interference accord covering the Adriatic and Tyrrhenian seas, formalizing zones of operation to prevent the kind of accidental conflict that could shut down the entire convoy system. These were not acts of idealism. They were hard-nosed recognitions that the infrastructure of Mediterranean commerce had become too valuable to sacrifice to competitive hostility, and that legal frameworks were the cheapest way to protect it. The financial architecture that grew around this commerce was even more consequential than the naval arrangements. Moving armies and cargo across the Mediterranean required capital at a scale that exceeded what any single merchant house could supply, and meeting that demand drove the republics toward innovations in credit and accounting that would define the modern economy. Venice established the Banco del Giro as early as 1157, one of the first public clearinghouses in European history, designed to manage the complex transfers of debt and payment that long-distance trade required. Genoa went further and more systematically. The Bank of St. George, founded in 1407, was a genuinely novel institution that managed public debt, extended credit to private merchants, and issued loans to foreign rulers, including Ferdinand II of Aragon, whose patronage would soon underwrite the Spanish Atlantic enterprise. The same institution that kept Genoese fleets operational in the Mediterranean extended a line of credit that reached, through several degrees of separation, all the way to the hull of the Santa Maria. Maritime law formalized what commercial practice had already established. Venice's Capitular Nauticum of 1256 standardized the contracts governing maritime employment, cargo liability, and dispute resolution in ways that reduced the risk premium on long voyages. Genoa's Regulae et Ordinamenta of 1441 extended this framework providing a comprehensive legal code for commercial activity at sea. And cutting across all of this was the gradual diffusion of double-entry bookkeeping, a system emerging from the merchant tradition of Amalfi and codified in the work of Luca Pacioli, which gave merchants and bankers the tools to track complex credit relationships across multiple currencies, partners, and time horizons. The spice trade could not have operated at its medieval scale without this kind of accounting infrastructure, and the accounting infrastructure would not have developed at the pace it did without the commercial pressure of the Mediterranean routes driving demand for it. Naval technology followed the money. The Venetian arsenal, built in the 12th century and now massively expanded over the following generations, was by the late 13th century capable of launching up to 100 galleys per year, an industrial output that had no equivalent anywhere in the medieval world, achieved through a degree of standardized manufacturing and labor organization that anticipates the factory system by several hundred years. Genoa contributed differently, developing and widely adopting the carrack, a larger, higher-sided vessel that could carry heavier cargo loads on longer voyages, and systematically integrating the magnetic compass into its navigational practice, extending the effective range of Mediterranean fleets into Atlantic waters and beyond. This is where the arc of medieval Mediterranean commerce bends directly into the story of the world. The capital accumulated through Crusader-era trade networks, the credit instruments developed to finance spice convoys, the navigational tools refined in the service of Eastern Mediterranean routes. These were the material that funded and equipped the explorers. Genoa's capital backed Columbus's 1492 crossing of the Atlantic. Venetian merchants contributed to John Cabot's 1497 voyage to North America. The Portuguese Atlantic ventures drew on financial relationships first developed in the Mediterranean trading world. The sea that had built the ancient world was not eclipsed by the age of oceanic exploration. It produced it, exporting its commercial techniques, its financial instruments, and its navigational confidence outward into every ocean on the planet. What happened in the Eastern Mediterranean between the First Crusade and the fall of Constantinople was not merely medieval commerce. It was the prototype of the modern global economy, assembled port by port, contract by contract, across the oldest trading sea in the world. The prototype had produced its successors, and the successors were about to change the coordinates of the world. When Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1498 and arrived in Calicut, he did not merely open a new trade route, he rerouted the entire logic of global commerce around a different axis. Spices, silks, and the luxury goods that had for centuries flowed through Alexandria and Venetian Fondaci could now travel directly from the Indian Ocean to Lisbon, bypassing the Eastern Mediterranean entirely. Within a generation, Antwerp and then Amsterdam replaced Venice as the commercial centres of the European world, and the sea that had held the gravitational centre of civilized exchange for 3 millennia found itself repositioned, not eliminated, but no longer the irreplaceable corridor it had been. The distinction matters. There is a difference between a sea that loses its monopoly and a sea that loses its importance, and the Mediterranean experienced only the first of those transitions. The Atlantic opening pulled the centre of gravity northward and westward, but it could not dissolve what the Mediterranean actually was, the junction between 3 continents, the throat through which land-based empire and seaborne trade had to pass if they wanted to connect Europe to Africa and the Near East. The spice routes had shifted, but the political and military stakes of controlling this body of water had, if anything, intensified. What changed was not the sea's strategic value, but the identity of the powers competing to extract it. The Ottomans had already demonstrated this with brutal clarity. By 1453, when Mehmed II's forces took Constantinople and extinguished the last of Byzantium, the empire had made the Eastern Mediterranean its operational domain, and it never stopped thinking about the sea's structural geometry. Ottoman strategists understood that the connection between their Mediterranean fleet and their Red Sea presence was a permanent military problem, one that a canal between the two could theoretically solve. In the 16th century, Ottoman planners seriously proposed engineering a waterway linking the Mediterranean to the Red Sea through the Sinai or Suez corridor, decades before any European power attempted it. The canal was never built, but the proposal itself is revealing. Even an empire commanding both shores of the eastern Mediterranean recognized that its naval reach was incomplete without a physical connection that would close the gap between its western and eastern fleets. The sea was still a strategic prize, and the prize was defined precisely by its position between worlds. For the next 3 centuries, the Mediterranean operated as a contested arena rather than a unified maritime space, claimed at different moments and different stretches by Ottoman naval power, Spanish Habsburg ambition, French imperial design, and the long-enduring commercial instincts of Venice and Genoa before their final decline. The British seizure of Gibraltar in 1704 introduced a new kind of control, a choke point strategy that allowed a naval power based in the Atlantic to project force into the Mediterranean at will, without needing to hold the sea's interior. That single fortified rock gave Britain leverage over every power that needed to move ships between the Atlantic and the Eastern Basin, and it remained the architectural cornerstone of British Mediterranean strategy for the next 2.5 centuries. The sea was not irrelevant in the age of Atlantic empires. It was, precisely because of its shape, long and narrow, flanked at each end by choke points, more susceptible to strategic control than any open ocean, and therefore more politically contested, not less. What finally restored the Mediterranean to something approaching its ancient centrality was not a military conquest, but an engineering project of extraordinary ambition. The Suez Canal opened in November 1869 after a decade of construction under Ferdinand de Lesseps, was 193 kilometres of lock-free waterway cut through the isthmus that had separated the Mediterranean from the Red Sea since the end of the last geological rearrangement of the region. The effect on global navigation was immediate and transformative. The Europe to Asia sea route, which had required rounding Africa's southern cape, adding roughly 8,900 kilometres to the journey, could now be accomplished through the canal in a passage that saved between 8 and 10 days for a steamship running at 20 knots. For the first time since the ancient world, the Mediterranean was not just a western endpoint in the chain of Asian commerce, it was the corridor through which that commerce moved. Every ship carrying Indian cotton, Chinese tea, or Persian oil to European ports now passed through the basin that Rome had once called its own lake. The strategic consequences reordered the imperial priorities of every power with maritime ambitions. Britain took effective control of the canal in 1875 when it purchased the Egyptian Khedive's shares, and from that moment the defence of the Suez Passage became one of the organising principles of British imperial strategy. The reason Egypt was occupied in 1882, the reason the Mediterranean fleet was maintained at strength through 2 world wars, and the reason the canal's nationalisation by Gamal Abdel Nasser in 1956 triggered a military response from Britain and France that proved, definitively, that post-imperial Europe could no longer enforce its will on the sea it had shaped. By 2021, the waterway was handling approximately 20,600 vessel transits per year, carrying roughly 12% of global trade by volume through a corridor that had been desert scrub 2 centuries earlier. The canal had made the Mediterranean indispensable to the 21st century supply chain in a way that no commercial strategist of the Venetian era could have imagined. But the canal accomplished something else, something with no precedent in the history of human engineering. It dissolved an ecological boundary that had been absolute for 5 million years. The Mediterranean and the Red Sea had been separated not merely by the Sinai Isthmus, but by chemistry. The hypersaline bitter lakes along the canal's route once acted as a natural barrier, too salty for most Red Sea species to cross. As canal traffic increased and the lake's salinity gradually equalized with the surrounding seawater, that barrier fell. The result is a process oceanographers call Lessepian migration, and it has introduced over 1,000 Red Sea organisms into the eastern Mediterranean, transforming the ecology of a basin that had developed its distinct biological character across millions of years of isolation. When the new Suez Canal expansion doubled transit capacity in 2015, researchers documented 8 new fish species entering the Mediterranean within the following years, an 8% rise in recorded non-native taxa, with detection rates doubling. The sea that had been reshaped by Zanclean floodwaters 5 million years ago was being reshaped again, this time by commerce and concrete. Its ancient biological boundaries redrawn by the same engineering ambition that had restored its place in global trade. The Mediterranean had travelled an extraordinary arc, from geological isolation to trading sea, from Rome's private lake to the periphery of Atlantic empires, and then back again, repositioned at the centre of the world's most heavily trafficked shipping lane. What it had never managed to do through all of these transformations was become unimportant. The doubling of detection rates was not an isolated number. It was a signal embedded in a larger transformation that researchers were only beginning to map when the expanded canal opened, and the more they looked, the more complicated the picture became. 8 new fish species in a few years sounds manageable, until you consider what it represents in ecological terms. Organisms that evolved in a different ocean, shaped by different pressures, entering a sea whose native species had no evolutionary history with them. Some of those arrivals are predators without local enemies. Others compete directly with fish that Mediterranean coastal communities have depended on for protein and income across recorded history. The question of whether this constitutes a crisis or merely an acceleration of change that was already underway turns out to be genuinely difficult to answer, and the scientists studying it have not yet reached consensus. The physical widening of the canal is the most obvious candidate for explanation. A deeper, broader channel allows larger volumes of water to move between the Red Sea and the Mediterranean, reducing the salinity gradients that once slowed biological exchange, and permitting fish that might have struggled against the current in the narrower original channel to cross more easily. But other researchers push back on canal widening as the primary driver, pointing to a set of compounding factors that the simple engineering narrative leaves out. The historic hypersaline barrier of the Bitter Lakes, which once constituted one of the canal's most effective natural filters, had already been eroding for decades before the 2015 expansion. The lake's salinity had been equilibrating with canal water gradually since the 20th century, meaning the chemical wall had been weakening long before anyone picked up a dredger. Remove that prior degradation from the timeline, and the expansion's independent contribution becomes harder to isolate. Overfishing adds another layer of difficulty to the analysis. Approximately 76% of Mediterranean fish stocks are currently overexploited, a figure that reflects generations of industrial harvesting pressure on a closed basin with limited capacity to replenish itself. When native predator populations are depleted, the ecological niches they once occupied become available, and an incoming species from the Red Sea that might otherwise struggle to establish itself suddenly finds both food and space waiting. The question of whether canal widening caused the invasion surge or whether habitat degradation and overfishing created the conditions for it is not merely academic. It determines what interventions might actually work, and the honest answer is that both processes are probably operating simultaneously in ways that are difficult to disentangle from observational data alone. Long-term monitoring in the eastern Mediterranean is limited, which means the baseline comparisons researchers need to resolve these competing hypotheses are incomplete. The debate remains open, and it is worth being precise about that. The statistics are real, but their interpretation is genuinely contested. What is less contested is what is happening to the sea itself, independent of what comes through the canal. The Mediterranean has warmed at a rate of between 0.29 and 0.44 degrees Celsius per decade since the early 1980s, a pace that exceeds the global ocean average and qualifies the basin as one of the most rapidly warming marine regions on the planet. The mechanism is self-reinforcing in ways that compound the biological consequences. As surface waters warm, the density difference between the warm upper layer and the cooler deep water increases, strengthening stratification and reducing the vertical mixing that normally carries nutrients from the seafloor toward the surface. A more stratified sea is a less productive sea, and a less productive sea is one whose native communities are under additional stress precisely at the moment when invasive competitors are arriving with greater frequency. Climate warming is not merely changing the Mediterranean in isolation, it is making the Mediterranean more hospitable to Red Sea species that are themselves adapted to warmer, more stratified conditions, which means the canal and the climate are operating as mutually reinforcing vectors of biological change. Marine heat waves, which were once exceptional events, are now projected to become longer, more frequent, and potentially up to 4 times more intense by the end of this century under high emission scenarios. The Mediterranean has already experienced several of the most destructive marine heat waves ever recorded in a closed basin. Events that bleach seagrass meadows, collapse invertebrate populations, and push cold-adapted endemic species toward range contractions from which recovery may take decades. These are not abstract projections, they are documented events, and their frequency is increasing within the timeframes of living scientists who have watched the same dive sites change from decade to decade. Sea level rise adds the third dimension to a portrait that is already under pressure from 2 directions. The Mediterranean's coastline is not uniform in its vulnerability. Rocky northern shores, the cliffs of Dalmatia, the promontories of the Greek islands, these can absorb significant sea level change without catastrophic consequence. But the flat, low-lying deltas built by sediment over thousands of years of agricultural civilization are a different category of problem entirely. The Nile Delta, which has supported continuous dense human settlement for at least 5,000 years and currently houses tens of millions of people in Alexandria and the surrounding agricultural zones, faces projected sea level rises of between roughly 15 and 33 centimetres by 2050, and between 30 centimetres and more than a metre by 2100, depending on the emissions trajectory humanity follows. Under a rise of 75 centimetres, between 1,500 and 2,600 square kilometres of delta land could be permanently inundated. Farmland, urban infrastructure, and archaeological sites representing some of the oldest continuous human occupation anywhere in the world. These projections carry uncertainty, particularly at the upper end where Antarctic ice sheet dynamics introduce variables that current models do not resolve with confidence, but the range itself describes a spectrum that runs from serious to catastrophic. The Mediterranean, in this framing, is not simply facing environmental pressure as one of many stressed regions. It is facing the convergence of processes that each have their own historical depth. The canal that reconnected it to the Red Sea after 5 million years of separation was built because the sea's geography made it indispensable to global commerce. The overfishing that has stripped its native stocks to critical levels is the accumulated result of the same human density and economic hunger that built the cities along its shores across 4 millennia. The warming that is restructuring its thermal architecture is the product of an industrial civilization that the sea itself, through its role in the spread of Roman organization, Byzantine agriculture, and Venetian finance, helped to make possible. The environmental pressures on the Mediterranean are not external to its history. They are, in a real sense, the culmination of it, the physical sea absorbing the consequences of the long human experiment that it enabled. Whether those consequences prove manageable or transformative depends on decisions that have not yet been made, in emissions agreements not yet honoured, in fisheries protections not yet enforced, in coastal adaptation investments not yet funded. The sea will persist regardless. What changes is the civilization that lives around it, and the question it now poses is whether the same capacity for adaptation that its shores produced across 5,000 years of continuous experiment can be brought to bear on pressures that, unlike any the Mediterranean has faced before, are global in origin and local in consequence. There is a temptation, when surveying the full arc of this sea's history, to conclude that the Mediterranean simply created Western civilization, that the geography did the work and the rest followed inevitably. That conclusion is too simple, and the history itself argues against it. What the Mediterranean provided was not creation but acceleration. It compressed exchanges that would otherwise have taken centuries into generations. It placed cultures close enough that their ideas, crops, technologies and legal systems could collide repeatedly, borrow from each other continuously, and produce cumulative results that no single shoreline could have generated alone. That is the mechanism worth holding on to, because it changes what this sea means. It was not an incubator sealed off from the outside world, but a circulatory system, one whose value lay precisely in the speed and density of what moved through it. The arc begins before any human hand touched the shore. When the Atlantic finally breached the barrier at Gibraltar and returned 5 million years of isolated brine to something recognizable as an ocean, the event was so violent, an estimated 68 to 100 sverdrups of water per second remaking the basin over a geological instant, that it reset the physical conditions for everything that followed. The sea that emerged from the Zanclean megaflood was not simply water filling a hole. It was a connected, temperate, navigable environment positioned at the junction of 3 continents, ringed by river deltas rich enough to support dense agriculture. Within a few thousand years of that refilling completing its long work, the first permanent settlements were appearing along shores that the sea made survivable and accessible in ways that open ocean could not. Egypt built its civilization on the Nile's fertility, but reached outward across the eastern Mediterranean for the cedar, copper, and tin that stone and grain could not provide. The Minoans turned the sea itself into their strategic territory, projecting power through trade networks rather than land armies. The Phoenicians extended those routes to their logical conclusion, planting harbours from the Levantine coast to the Atlantic approaches and carrying with them not just goods, but the alphabetic script that would become the ancestor of almost every writing system in the Western world. The Greeks scattered their city-states across the basin like seeds, each one a political experiment that collectively produced the vocabulary of democracy, philosophy, and civic architecture that still structures how Western societies argue about themselves. None of these civilizations invented their achievements in isolation. Each of them was, in part, assembled from what the sea brought within reach. Rome synthesized it. 4 centuries of Mare Nostrum turned the basin into a single administrative and economic space, and the legal framework that held it together, the Corpus Juris Civilis, refined under Justinian but rooted in centuries of Roman jurisprudence, became the structural skeleton of civil law across Europe and every territory European powers later colonized. The roads are gone or buried, the aqueducts are ruins, the law is still operating. When the empire fractured, Byzantium preserved and transmitted the institutional inheritance, while Arab expansion introduced sugarcane, rice, citrus and almonds into a Mediterranean agriculture that had previously relied on far narrower staples, simultaneously threading the sea into the Silk Road network and creating the commercial corridors that medieval Europe would inherit and extend. Venice, Genoa and Pisa turned those corridors into finance. The gold ducat became the first truly international currency, Venetian merchants pioneered moneys of account and state-run banking, and the capitalist instruments that would eventually drive European global expansion were tested and refined on routes that had been navigated since the Bronze Age. What the Mediterranean built then was not any single civilization, but the conditions under which civilizations could continuously learn from, challenge, and transform each other. A feedback loop running from geology through agriculture, law, finance and technology, each revolution producing the platform for the next. And now that system is under pressure in ways that reverse the direction of consequence. The warming that is intensifying marine heat waves and restructuring the sea's thermal layers, the sea level rise that threatens to swallow Nile Delta farmland that has fed cities for 5,000 years, the biological disruption flowing through the widened canal. These are not misfortunes visiting the Mediterranean from outside. They are, as this history makes clear, the downstream product of the industrial and commercial civilization that the Mediterranean's own exchanges helped to generate. The sea enabled the experiment has now changed the sea, but the Mediterranean has never been a finished chapter. It has been continuously rewritten by geological violence, by the ambitions of empires, by the movement of peoples who arrived as conquerors and remained as inheritors, by technologies that changed what distance meant and what water could carry. It remains a living historical system, warmer now, biologically altered, physically threatened, but still connecting the same three continents, still carrying commerce, still generating the friction between cultures that has always been its most consequential product. The question it puts to the present is the same one it has always put to whoever lived on its shores. What will you do with what the sea makes possible?